what does the word gutsy mean to you?
Hmm. Yeah, gutsy is a feeling. It's a visceral feeling when it's like, I mean, running a retreat in Oaxaca this summer with 1 month notice was a gutsy move. And I know that feeling in my gut. And to trust that feeling to say, like, yes, move towards those things that are like, oh my gosh, this seems impossible. When it is truly aligned, like you said, it will flow with more ease and it wants to happen. And those things that want us to be that like vessel or vehicle to make them happen often can get that feeling in our gut.
You're listening to the Gutsy Podcast, where we talk about all things real, raw, and ridiculous about running a business authentically. Whether you need an inspirational pick-me-up or a swift kick in the mental ass, the Gutsy Podcast is your bi-weekly guide to getting out of your head and back into action. I'm Laura Ora, branding and mindset coach for female entrepreneurs, CEO of Works & Co., and your host on this journey through entrepreneurship. It's time to fuel your gutsy. Have you ever felt off, not quite yourself, or maybe even got a burst of creativity or ideas out of nowhere, only to look up and see, oh, it's a full moon, or hey, there's a new moon because I can't see it? The lunar phases affect us all in different ways during different parts of the cycle. And when we lean into what they are and what it's calling of us, the moon can be a powerful tool for peace, creation, and success. Today, we're talking with April McMurtry about working with the different phases of the lunar cycle. So whether you're brand new to this or you're seasoned, there's lots of great information in here to start embracing the lunar cycle in your life and in your business. April is an internationally known lunar facilitator and course creator. She's helped over 5,000 people connect with the lunar cycle to energetically align their mind, body, and spirit during times of transition and self-discovery. She's the host of Between the Moon podcast and founder of The Moon is My Calendar, where she offers students a variety of resources and courses, including her signature self-published annual New Moon Calendar journal. Before we chat with April, though, I want to let you know that I've got a handful of live classes coming up. I'm finding that being face-to-face with you is one of the most profound ways that I can help you shift through whatever blocks, challenges, or opportunities that you are ready to embrace. So if you go to lauraora.com/learn, you'll see that there's a handful of classes. November, we are shifting your resistance. So if we recognize what you're resisting, why you're resisting it, and talking through how to shift it, gosh, that opens up a tremendous amount of doors. Also coming up in November is the next Mindfuckery workshop. This is a 5-day workshop to help you get out of your own way. If you've been feeling stuck, you want to move some shit forward, you want to face some things and get inspired all at the same time, listen, this workshop has been changing lives. And last but not least, in December, we're going to talk about going from overwhelmed to focus. If you got a lot of shit going on, you're not sure what to do, you're not sure where to focus, where do I need to put my attention, then that class is going to be fantastic for you. So all of those are online, open for registration. Again, you can go to lauraora.com/learn to sign up for any and all today. April, welcome to the Gutsy Podcast.
Goodness, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We're gonna talk all about the moon. I had to scale back my questions today because this is a topic that I could just like sit and talk to somebody about all day long. So before we dig into all of that goodness, so tell me a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey and what has led you to where you are today.
Such a good question because it was super unexpected. I'm a classroom teacher and I have a master's in teaching. And so I was in the classroom for 10, maybe almost 15 years in different roles. And it was really having children that there was just a point where I was like, this whole, I can do it all in the home and outside of the home. And all of that was like, that's not happening. So things took a major detour and I stepped away from the classroom and started creating a moon calendar. The journey has been learning a lot about just online presence. It's learning about like repeated cycles and what to do, like what to sort of keep and what to change. I'm still learning. I've taken like the slow growth approach. I think there's times where it feels like, where things like what's the capacity? And I feel like that's kind of a question I keep coming back to is what is the capacity? Because coming to this work, like many people do, is from this place of burnout, of I can do it all and then just like load up the plate. So there's a lot of unlearning that has had to happen as well.
I hear that loud and clear.
Mm.
Tremendous amount of unlearning. And then, and isn't it ironic, especially going into spiritual work, how that just kind of gets amplified? And it's, I don't know, it just seems like such a ironic conversation, right? Because like you said, we're often in burnout. You switch over, I can do it all. And then now we're perpetuating the burnout because we're learning all these things and we're doing so much more. And like, it's just this really bizarre transition.
Yeah. And it's so creative, right? I think that's the part was like, ooh, I'm learning to build my own website. Ooh, I'm learning how, like all of the things. So there's this like creative piece to it. Then there is that, well, what is my finite? Like, what am I allotting to figuring out all the things? And am I spreading that out over time or doing it condensed? Yeah. Early on, there was like a course that I was running and it was amazing. And people were getting, like just how to maintain and tend to our health as we're putting things out. That was early on. And I had these moments where I was like, okay, never again, like red flags, warning signs, when to take a pause. Like what that's just when I was thinking just even about your podcast, the gutsiness of when it is to take a pause and be like, I need to regroup. I need to like check my priorities. And then really when to like, I'm gonna just keep going. And I don't like the feeling of pushing through, but there is even in the natural world that energy of pushing through, like what it takes for flowers to open and what it takes for all of that. I connect with a lot with the natural world within my business and how I move and work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many different seasons, right? Phases of life and business and even progression. And I think the big difference is knowing when to pause and when to push, right?
Yeah.
Like that, ladies and gentlemen, that can be a whole nother podcast episode right there in its own, because that's really a self-learning process, is knowing within yourself when it's time to like pull back, retreat, refill, and when it's time to just like full body lean in and all systems go.
Yeah. And this is so lunar. I mean, what we're talking about for anyone who is tuned into the moon, this is that language of waxing and waning. I mean, it is what the moon can teach us when we're really building a relationship and deepening our connection with the moon is embedded within the lunar cycle. And so that's where I turn to learn how, right, as you said, when we're in these patterns of like, I can do it all, and then we sort of pivot into something else, but haven't yet learned how to work differently or approach our work differently. It was a time of turning to the moon of like, help me. I don't even know how
Mm.
to rest. Like, please show me, please show me. And that has unfolded over time. And it's so, so beautiful.
So I'm sure we have listeners that are kind of, maybe some are brand new to learning about the moon cycles. Maybe some are super seasoned and they're just coming here to gain some more knowledge and information. Let's just kind of neutralize all that and say, what is the lunar cycle? Tell us from your perspective, just so we have an idea of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, beautiful. So the lunar cycle is what I see is like any cycle doesn't necessarily have a beginning. So where do you choose to start? And
Hmm.
for me and for a lot of people, it's like that starting of the new moon. And so finding that like entry point, starting place of this reset. And so from new moon to new moon, then is a lunar cycle with all of the phases waxing up to the full moon and then waning back to the new moon. Recently, I've been on this like quest of like busting the myth of the like 13 times 28. When a lot of people will talk about the new moon, there's sort or not the moon, the lunar cycle and the moon, there's a shorthand of, oh, it's a 28-day cycle. It's a very common like misconception for, and I think it's so reinforced that a lot of people don't question like, oh yeah, the moon cycle. Like, would you say the moon cycle is 28 days, or is that what you've
Yeah,
just?
I mean it's about a month ish, you
Yeah,
know.
right. It's about a monthish. So there's this approximation that most people will say is 28 days, and then that there's 13 lunar cycles in a year. It's like there's a whole bunch of memes going around, and I was like, really? Because if you if you track, and so I practice lunar tracking and I created a tool for lunar tracking, like if you track every day and phase by phase, you'll find like that's actually not true. So the lunar cycle is 29 and a half days. And sometimes the moon is moving more quickly, closer to Earth, and sometimes, so it's not this like perfect neat in a box. And so that's the part of this 28 days, 13 cycles. It's like this attempt to fit the moon into a box that doesn't actually match what's happening in nature.
Mm.
So with the natural cycles and the practice of really connecting in with the moon and the moon cycle and with ourself, like building that relationship, it just starts to unfold, and then you get to start to have a sense. So yes, it's about a month. It's some cycles are 29 days, some are 30 days. There's 12 cycles in a year, except every about 3 years there's 13. And
Okay.
so there's like almost something that is asking us to get out of, like we were talking about, that kind of deprogramming and relearning this way to be in relationship with time that is not as precise as we might like it to be. It's just not. And that's part of the reason why the moon was like given the boot out of the Gregorian calendar. Lunar time was always a part of timekeeping. And then it was just like, oh, this is just kind of complicated. And so let's make it nice and tidy with the sun, even though we have to add in this extra day every 4 years or whatever. And then the moon just like disappeared from the reference point of time telling. And so coming back to the lunar cycle and coming back to lunar time and attuning to the moon is this attuning into something that all of our ancestors were very so aware of and connected to, that after what it's been 500 plus years of this other timekeeping calendar system, that it's just like stripped it away. So there's this rupture of connection with time as a relationship with natural cycles, to then repairing that. So
Mm.
maybe that was a longer answer, but that starting point of like the moon moves differently in time telling than the sun. Some people would describe them as like incompatible. Of like the sun's doing the sun thing and the moon's doing the moon thing, but they do meet up, and that meetup is on the new moon. It's like that coming back together for the moon to start its next journey around the earth.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about what the different cycles of the moon are and how do each of those impact us?
Hmm. The different cycles, or the different
The
phases?
different phases, yes.
Yeah. So within the cycle, right, it's like how many phases are there? I think this is even another question, that there's not one correct, right answer. In Vedic timekeeping, in the Indian subcontinent, there's a whole other way of understanding the moon, which like I've only just like tip of the iceberg. So beautiful, and so each phase is connected with a goddess. So it's very like deep wisdom. For the lunar cycle, often it's divided into the four main phases. So there's the new moon, the first quarter moon, the full moon, and the last quarter moon. Or it can be into the 8 phases of like the halfway point between each of those. One way to connect in with the lunar cycle and the phases is just the waxing half of just like, what is that? Where do we see that? What is that opening up and that growth? And those are the seasons of like spring and summer. And those are the phases of like the new moon and the crescent and the first quarter up until the full. And then that second half is that waning. And so where do we see that? Like that's the season of the fall and the winter and the going inward. So there's this pulse. And that's part of just attuning to this. Like we have that in the solar year, that bigger pulse of seasons of like, ooh, it's springtime. We can kind of like sense or feel what that's going to be like, even though every year is slightly different. That expansion and then that contraction of the seasons. So that's happening like in a mini way over each lunar cycle, that like pulse of opening.
Mm.
And then I'm like using my hands because it's like a very
Yeah.
visceral, embodied, like, ooh, I'm opening. Okay. And now I'm coming back inward. So again, it's a relationship. And I think there is, especially on social media and Instagram, and like ways of like, do this on the new moon or do this on the full moon. Kind of like recommendations or maybe like a recipe of something to follow. And I would really say it's a relationship that is day by day and phase by phase. And that's cultivated over time. It's not like oh, what should I do for the new moon? It's a feeling into, ooh, this new moon actually might feel really like a creative spark that wants something juicy is like happening in that time. Whereas another new moon might feel like, I just need to pause and step back and go inward and not be outward at all. And that's that dynamic relationship of each of us where we're at in our life. And then having this reference of the lunar cycle. I get the sense that for some people, there's this goal of alignment in the way of on the full moon, I should feel this way and be outward and celebrating and like dancing around the fire. And what if some of us don't feel that way? It's almost like how can we dance with that to see really where we're at and work with the moon as this reference point. Yeah, I don't have this like really clear cut and dry response to like the phases because it's a felt sense. And it can be supported by certain practices, and I'm happy to share some of those to be more like concrete and specific.
Yeah, that sounds great. Because I think you've mentioned this a few times. I think it can get a little bit confusing, like, oh, I should do this during the full moon, or I shouldn't do that during the new moon, and like yes and no's and rights and wrongs. And then it's like, now I'm afraid I'm doing something wrong, or I'm going to call in some funky energy. So maybe you can help us to clear some of that up. What are some good concrete practices or things that you recommend during the different phases?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for like summing that up because I think it can get into this paralysis of like, well, am I supposed to release right now? I don't know. When I release, did I do the wrong thing? And then like, so trusting intuition, often for anyone, I'm not an astrologer, but I'm a student. And I see that when people are just tuned into their intuition, they know anyway. They don't even have to know what's happening in the cosmos. My kids, my youngest, will like feel that the urge to clear out things right before the new moon. And that feeling. So when you feel that, like, oh, I need to make space. So a beautiful practice before the new moon, like that week leading up to the new moon. It's a great time to clear space. It's a great time to like, I'm looking at all these stacks of papers here. I've actually gone through my files. So making like a burn pile, like things that are just you want to release the energy of. That can be supportive before a new moon because it is like marking this ending and really being able to say like, this is no longer needed. I'm making space for something new. I'm composting and giving this back in whatever way. Often for me, burning, I have like a little fire pit that it's a practice. So any dried plants that I have that I want to put into, and often papers or, things. So setting aside that time before the new moon so that then when the new moon comes, there is this space for like, ooh, okay, there is space. What else? What is it that I want to call in? What am I making space for? The new moon marks a new beginning and a new cycle. And really, once you start really like deepening this practice, it's like each lunar cycle is this lifetime. So like, what is this particular chapter or even a chapter of my life to go along with the lunar cycle? So the new moon's often talked about as a time for setting intentions. In the new moon calendar and journal that I created, because I found I was writing my intentions in just journals mixed in with grocery lists and like the thing that was like, what was my intention again? So this practice that came from meeting on the new moon with a dear friend and colleague, my friend Sita Davis. We started this practice without the journal, but then once it was like, oh, here's the space, then there's a place for writing your seeds of intention. And just for marking that, because anytime we set out on a journey, it's like, where am I headed? What's my guiding lights? Like, what are some of the things where I want to focus and put my energy? And just marking that. There's a place for creating a mandala. So it could be like a collage or even just like writing a word and decorating it. Sometimes mine are very simple pencil, and sometimes they're really like more elaborate, just kind of depends. So that's the new moon of like setting the course. But it's always every phase is like connected to the one before. So if you haven't cleared things out, it might be hard to feel like, oh, what am I saying yes to? Because there's all this carryover. So at the first quarter, oftentimes it's talked about as this like crisis point or this choice point or this, the moon itself is split down the middle. So it's kind of like, I mean, we can even visually see which way am I headed? Like which choice? It's like this crossroads. And so whatever has been almost like put in motion around the new moon, then deciding kind of like which weeds to pull, which things that are like, I think it comes down to like, do I think I can do it all? And can I really? And can I do it all well? Or am I fooling myself? And finding, and I was finding this myself coming around to the last quarter, all the things that I'd said yes to, then I had to like revisit, and often that disappointment of like, I can't follow through on all of the things that I said yes to. So the moon gives us this like framework to work within, so that the first quarter is like, all right, I'm making a choice to say yes to this particular project or this intention, whatever it might be. And then coming up to the full moon, it's almost, it can be really what's being illuminated, of like, what is the moon shedding light onto? Like, what can I see more clearly now that in the dark of the moon, which isn't, you know, another way to refer to the new moon, in that dark of the moon, maybe I couldn't see, and now coming to the fullness of like, what's being revealed. And then from there, yes, like sometimes there's things to celebrate. Sometimes there's things that are just like come to the surface and it's too much. And so it's just like, you know, possibly like so intense where it's just like so much energy that just has built up. It's almost this way to like have a witness to ourself when we're connected with the moon in this way, because we can see like what's shining light on ourself that we can see in a very non-judgmental way. It's just like, oh, I'm really noticing that I can't handle everything and I'm just snapping, and I need to look back and see, how did I get here? And that's that daily tracking or that daily practice of just like tuning in, checking in. Where's the moon? Where am I? So that's the full moon. And so often people will talk about after the full moon then being a time of release. And again, I would say when we trust our intuition, we'll know if that's the timing, or maybe it's a little later, like at the last quarter, which this is this other crossroads of, okay, it's time to go inward and it's time to like end a cycle rather than that constant like go, go, go. That last quarter is this cue. And sometimes we're not ready. Sometimes I'm not ready. I'm like, I want to keep going. But then I see what happens. I'm like, well, I am wiser now, so I can, here's this choice. And I'll, you know, it's really like how to collect the data, almost like BS. It's probably the closest I get to being scientific in my life is like, you know, collecting all of this, what ends up turning into kind of like insight of how do I want to apply what I've learned through the lunar tracking for decisions that I make in the future.
Amazing. You mentioned like burning and intentions for the new moon. Do you have any full moon recommendations or best
Yeah.
practices?
Full moon. I mean, just even being in the moonlight, it's so like there's the quality of the moonlight that is so different than the sun that, you know, sometimes I will put out water and make moon water if I'm feeling it, but it's not like, oh, you have to do that every time. You know, people who work with crystals or work with tools, like whatever wants to be bathed in the moonlight is almost, it could be like a cleansing or a purification practice of like being like washed in the moonlight. But yeah, I sometimes I'll go out and just like be intentionally moonbathing. Yeah, and sometimes it feels like a time to gather, and often that is more seasonal, like a more summery. The full moon is more like the summertime of the lunar cycle. But then when we are in winter, it might not even, you know, it might be like staying closer to home and having, it's a very personal thing. So I think that's what my encouragement is to like, maybe you want to take a bath. Like maybe there is an opportunity, like, okay, once a lunar cycle, you know, if you have your bathtub or a way to be in water, the moon connects us with more of that fluid state. And so putting our, you know, being able to immerse ourselves. And even if it's once a cycle, there's some practices, it's like just if we know that there's things that are helpful for our own self-care, to sort of place them on the lunar cycle in some way that makes sense. You know, that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I love to do this, but I know it may be new to some people. What are the benefits of moon water, which is basically putting a jar of water or a glass of water out underneath the moonlight. But what are the benefits of doing that?
It's just, I feel like it's this beautiful way to like drink the moon, like to drink that the to like imbibe and like participate in a kind of a ritual and communion with the moon. And sometimes I'll put flower, it's again, it can just be water. I think there's some, yeah, I've made some really beautiful like roses, and sometimes it'll go along with what sign the moon is in, and hibiscus, along with the water. But even just that simple, this communing with the moon, it can help to strengthen our intuition.
Hmm.
Intentional. It's an intentional way to build a relationship.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'm a big nerd for setting out my moon water, and my husband does it with me, and it's just a
Oh,
really beautiful practice because, and maybe it's just how I feel about it, but I don't know, it just always feels much more nourishing and like it gets in your body differently. You know what I mean? But I'm also super sensitive to what the moon's doing. So, my experience may be very different than someone else's. And that's actually one of my next questions is why does the moon affect us? Because it affects our emotions, it affects our physical body, our mental body, like our energy fields, right? Like it impacts us. Why?
there's actually a whole podcast episode. There's a podcast called The Emerald, and the host is named Josh. And I don't know him personally. Someone had sent me his podcast. I was like, oh, this is about the moon. You should listen to it. I finally just got around to listening to it. And so this really comes from that deep reflection that he was sharing about humans we're tidal. We came from the ocean. Like we came from this place, like life came from this place that responds to the moon. And so that pulse that I was describing, of like that pulse is the high tide and low tide, that our bodies in a cellular structural way, our bodies were immersed in that, in the waters. And so now we're on land. We still have water in our body. I've read other scientific studies that were like, oh, it's so minuscule, it doesn't have an impact. It's like they'll admit like, okay, certain crabs and other like marine life, their feeding habits, their mating habits, all these things that go along with the moon. But in this one particular book, they're like, would not extend that to humans. And I'm like, interesting. Why not? Because what would we be admitting to say that, yes, the moon has an influence? Not that it's like power over or control, like controlling us in any way, but what if we really were connected with these tides of life that so many other animals and plants and life on the earth is? Like, what if we're actually a part of that we're not like special in some way, that we're not? But I love that sense of like being a tidal being.
If you're digging the Gutsy podcast and want to go a little bit further, I invite you to sign up for one of my next mindset classes. So in November, there are actually 2 classes. We start off the month with shifting your resistance. You often hear me say that the thing that you want the most is often behind the thing that you resist the most. Planting a seed there for you. So if that's got your curiosity going around and you are ready to shift what you're resisting so that you can actually do the thing that you want to do, then this class is going to be phenomenal for you. And then later in November, the next Mindfuckery workshop. Listen, this workshop is changing lives. It's helping people to get unstuck, to get clear, to start to really actually see and feel the changes in their life and in their business. By the end of the week, you come into the class a different person than what you leave. And that is such an incredible thing to witness. So both of those classes are up and live. You can sign up at lauraora.com/learn. April has some more nuggets of wisdom to share with you. So let's get into the second half of today's episode.
So yeah, I think because it does come from the water and the gravity of the moon and that pull that actually creates the bulge of the oceans that we experience as high tide and low tide. that that's in our bodies too, that that's
Mm.
in our like evolution and our DNA of like, where did we come from, which is such this amazing mystery of like, how is that actually possible? But that moon, I feel like that connects us. It connects us with all of life as we're doing this pulse and this dance on this planet.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm probably not going to say the stat right, but we're like 80% water. So,
We're a lot of
and
liquid. There's a lot
yeah,
of liquid
we got a
inside.
lot of liquid going on. And if you
Yeah.
think about, high tide and low tide at the beach every single day, all day long, we are one of the same, right? We have a lot of similar characteristics. So, I think it's important to just really start to notice because again, I think it can get a little bit overwhelming. And then you throw in things like, well, which sign is the moon in? And what else is going on? And right now we're going into there's eclipses happening, and
Yeah.
there's just, and it's like, well, what am I supposed to do? So
Right.
what
Mhm.
recommendations do you have for some newly curious minds that are like, I don't know how to keep up with all this, but I'm super interested in it.
Such a great question because it's daily. The moon is always changing and always on the move. So like if you blink your eyes, it's like, wait, it was just new moon. How is it full now? And I really want to draw this correlation between when we lose track of the moon, we're also losing track of ourselves.
Mm.
So if we can keep track of the moon and like pace with the moon, we can do that with ourselves. The tool that I created, even just this morning when I was thinking about our conversation, I was like, I wonder if there's new insight to share. Like what is it? And it really was like for those of us who have a hard time showing up for ourselves, especially when we're entrepreneurs and there's like no boss telling us what to do and no, how am I showing up? It's almost like, well, in the meantime, show up for the moon. Like show up, like do it if it's maybe easier to do it for someone else. The moon can be almost like that, like surrogate, showing up for yourself by showing up for the moon. So I'm not a huge journaler. Like I've gone through periods of like morning pages and things that are, I think probably a lot of people and anyone who's listening is like, I've tried a new habit. It lasted for a little while and then now it's gone. So what am I going to do? I will say the lunar tracking is something that is stuck for me. This will be the ninth year in a row. And I'm not somebody who has like regular habits that I can keep. It may be something just to experiment with. I have like on my newsletter, there's a free download of the current lunar cycle, and just to have it and just to kind of mark this, I have my calendar here, just to kind of like mark your way along with the lunar cycle. So it's this, like, even if it's just a dot or a star or something to follow along, even so I make a wall calendar as well, even if it's just looking and locating like, okay, here's the moon today, it's October, whatever the date is on the Gregorian calendar, and just seeing it visually. I feel like especially for people who are visualists, like having a moon calendar up and visible to start to train our self really to see like, oh, this is a cycle. Like, yes, we can say it's Monday or Tuesday or whatever, but it's this part of a cycle. So there's something really about having a lunar calendar that is circular. There's a lot that are still grids. And so it's like how to anchor time with the cycle rather than month. And it's a shifting. So there's a lot of women who in working with this tool have told me it's like, my mind is like going between these two systems of time. And it's like, yeah, it's relearning, it's repatterning, it's remembering. And so I would say just even if it's like, I would say really following the lunar calendar, having a lunar calendar like to reference, to begin to bring it into your field. The first thing that I did, because I didn't grow up having moon practices, it wasn't something my mom would like point out, like, oh, look, the moon's following us home, out the wind, like driving at night. But I think a lot of people, it's like the full moon is very obvious because the sun sets and then the moon rises and it's big and it's bright. But what about all the other phases? So the full moon is kind of the starting place for someone who's like, oh, I'm kind of curious. If you put maybe a reminder in your phone just to go outside and see the moon rise. And then every day after that, the moon rises later and later. That's kind of how the cycle works, is like why the moon isn't always in the same place is because every day the average is about an hour later. Being able to see the moon rise and start to notice and like look in the sky, it's almost like our eyes can become magnetic. And so I would say like, if there's like something you're turning over in your mind or thinking about, like look up and then see if you can see the moon in the day or the night because she's there equally in the day and night, which I think is another misconception of like the moon's only, it's like actually the moon, half of the sight, like a whole half is in the as well. So after that, like a full moon, just noticing. And I mean, for me, for many years, I made a date. Like I would, after dinner, okay, I'm going out to watch the moon rise. And there's a ridge where I go to hike. So kind of finding a place in your home, space, town, city, where you can have like a landmark to view the moon, make a date and have it be on the moon's time rather than when it's, for me, it's like, well, when is the, and then before creating the calendar, I had on the new moon for probably 5 or 6 years with Sita. We would meet on the new moon. So just like, okay, next Thursday is the new moon, come over and we'll do our, like, basically the check-in of what happened this cycle, what are our intentions for the next cycle. And so seeing if there's someone that, you know, if you don't already have like a moon friend, a moon sister, to do that with, where you get to sort of hold each other to that, are like, I don't know, maybe accountability. I don't know what the word is, but that having that new moon where you can't see the new, where you, it's not a visible thing, right? The full moon's the visible part, visible connection in the sky. And the new moon brings us into a space of like trust, of like, what if I can't see the thing? It's with business too. Is like, what if I can't see the thing yet that I'm trying to create? Like, how do I actually have trust? And the moon teaches another lesson of like that teaching of trust is like the moon just disappeared, like 3 days, no moon, can't even comes back. And it's like, I can trust the things that I can't see
yet. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, that's a beautiful transition into my next question of how do we lean into the phases of the moon in our life, in our business for next levels of success and growth?
Yeah, I think it's both that, what I was saying of like, what's the seed? What's the thing you can't see yet? And what are, you know, marking those milestones of like, what's the crescent phase of that, of the unknown thing? I have this, I have this like project, I have this, whatever it might be. I actually created, what did I call it? The moon seed, like kind of coming up with questions along the way of what is, when a project goes through all of those phases, which they do, of the growth and the coming into like, what kinds of things do I need to make decisions about around this? Like, what is the full form of, like, can we imagine that seed? Like, what is the thing we want to harvest? I mean, that is that bringing in that overlay of the lunar cycle and our sacred work in this world is what gets harvested once that seed actually comes to fruition. Who's benefiting from it? Like, who are we sharing? What do we be able to give back? Like, what is a satisfaction? You know, it's clear if I have a pomegranate tree, like the thing I'm harvesting is like, the thing I want is the pomegranate. If I go and plant like a seed of something that I don't actually want to eat, when it's fully formed, we could find ourselves like taking care of something. Then we're like, oh, but that's not actually, I'm trying to think of something I don't like. Like, what would be something that you could plant that you're like, oh, I mean, I even like fava beans. So that's not even like, what would I plant? I would be like, oh, wait, I don't even really want to harvest that thing.
Well, I think in like business, if we look at it just from, you know, from that perspective, you know, building an offer that you don't feel fully aligned with, right? Taking on a new client that you just had a gut check that just wasn't passing the mark, right? Or even outside of business, taking on a new job that you're not feeling in alignment with, or saying yes to joining something that you don't feel called to, right? Like those are planting seeds, and then that thing grows. And if that's what we're growing, and then it's being amplified by the lunar cycle, eventually that full moon's going to come around and shine a light on it to remind you that, hey, this isn't what we were going to do. And now things feel kind of wonky, or you're in a situation, or you have to make a different decision, or like, I don't know, to me, full moons always like kind of shove everything to the forefront. Like, hey, here are some things that we need to handle. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think that just in life, those are some seeds that kind of come to mind when I'm thinking about, okay, well, what are you planting? And knowing that thing is probably going to grow. Do you want it to? Exactly.
And what gets surrounded by the weeds, like what actually could like start to suffocate when there's too many things. And yeah, clarity is a process. Like clarity, I've been having conversations with other entrepreneurs, like other friends in my life who have businesses, and we're like, is clarity this thing like that comes in flashes and we have to keep getting clear. Like, it's not like I'm clear now and everything's clear and just will keep being clear.
That would be fantastic.
That would be really, and I was like, I think it's this ongoing process. And that's part of what the moon reminds us too, is like, oh, I can see, like with the full moon, like I can see. And now I need to decide, do I like what I see? Like, is this what I want to be harvesting? Or do I need to like backtrack, unwind, kind of go revisit where did this come from? This seed, like this was somebody else's idea or something I thought I should be doing. And then there's certain moons. I don't know if you've experienced this. Like there are certain moons, whether or not it's what sign the moon is in or what time of year or season, when we have this relationship that deepens of like, oh, the last time the moon was in this phase or this sign, these are some of the things that showed up. And there's other cycles that is like sort of, deeper levels, more advanced after we have this working relationship with all of the phases, of some things that might seem to come out of nowhere, that there's a way to kind of track back lunar phases to see the origins. And so that's part of the benefit of lunar tracking is actually the being able to look back, because so much happens in life that the thinking that we can actually remember all of those little micro decisions, like all those little like conversations or comments or whatever, that can eventually lead to something that's this more fully formed. There is like this, a practice in a way to kind of, when we have a little snapshot at each phase that we can reference. Like I'll give an example. This summer, I led a trip in Oaxaca, a new moon, the Oaxaca new moon retreat. And it seemed to come out of nowhere. I mean, it did in some ways come out of nowhere, but with this lunar tracking of going backwards, I was able to see where some of those seeds and that origin came from. And so even though it felt very spontaneous and like quick and out of the blue, like who plans a retreat to Mexico in a month and is like, all right, people, who's coming, who's on board, had everything come together. But that everything coming together quickly was actually so much groundwork that wasn't necessarily intentional. Let's plan a retreat to go to Mexico. Like it didn't look like that, but that's what it formed into. And it was so beautiful and so magical. And it felt very in sync with the cycle.
That's beautiful. I mean, that's alignment as well, right? I mean, when
it happens so fast,
when you're in full alignment, it will never stop amazing me how quickly and clearly things can pull together when you're in alignment. Like that's where the magic of all of your work comes together, and you get to enjoy the fruits of your labor, right? So one of my final questions for you is, and I found this really interesting in your form, is since we're talking about using the moon and energies to be successful and just kind of to grow and expand, you mentioned how knowing your Venus sign can really play a big part in your success. So tell me a little bit about what that is and how that plays a part.
And so Venus has a cycle, and really part of the learning the lunar cycle is that sort of like how that applies to the Venus cycle that goes through phases as well and forms beautiful sacred geometry in the sky. And so we can know the phase of Venus that we were born under, where Venus was as either a morning star or an evening star, which has different qualities as well, kind of similar to a waxing moon or a waning moon. There's just ways to personalize that. And so seeing where Venus was in relationship with the sun, in relationship with the moon, it's so many relationships. And then knowing our sign for Venus as well. I mean, Venus does, like, it connects us in with our worth and our value and what we bring to the world. And in many ways, like how we make that beautiful, like how we make our offerings beautiful. And Venus appears in the natural world as like the flowers of Venus. Venus makes a 5-petaled rose in the sky. And so anytime that there's 5-petaled flowers, I'm like, oh, Venus is here. And yeah, so Venus, like, I'm not going to go like, it's something to look into. I mean, rather than interpreting saying Venus in this sign means this or this sign, it's a relationship, and it's worth sort of like exploring and looking into and feeling into how Venus wants to express herself, like through the heart and through what feels most like where that abundance of think of like a rose bush full of flowers. There's no holding back. Like, it's like, here, I offer you all of the beauty that you could ever imagine. And I will say Venus was very present at the retreat that I mentioned in Oaxaca in Mexico. She was meeting up with the moon and about to sort of that pendulum swing from being an evening star and disappearing, just like the moon disappears. Everything has this time of disappearance and then reappearing as the morning star. So we got to see the last glimpse of Venus meeting up with the moon in the evening sky from this rooftop in Oaxaca in Mexico. And there were so many ways of just tracing back these 5-petaled roses or the Venus star. There's different ways that people refer to that pattern of this bigger cycle of time, that just everything seemed to come into play in this, how we embody Venus. Like, how is it that you embody the things that you love? So much of like what really lights you up and moving towards that. And even without knowing your Venus sign, sometimes it's just this confirmation when you already know that, like you've already done the self-discovery, and then learning more about your Venus almost like helps to confirm.
So the Venus sign is amplifying like our offering in the world, like who we are and where we shine brightest, and where people, when we're fully in that and embody that, and correct me if I'm wrong in any of this, this is just what I'm taking from our conversation. When we fully embody that, it feels like that's where aligned success can really come into play. Am I hearing that right?
Or when our heart, like when we're really in that space of our heart, we're not doing the things we think we should be doing, the things that we think that, like when we're outside of ourselves, when we're in that space of the heart, and when we're like listening and coming from that place where things just want to be like, whether it's through, in whatever the way that Venus wants to express that. And for mine, so just for giving an example, my sun and Venus are both in Capricorn. So there's these moments that Venus meets up with the sun. And I was born very close to one of those moments. And different astrologers have given different interpretations of that. It's very interesting. So that's that part of like, if someone else tells you from the outside, or if you start to really explore like from the inside, what is that? What is that having this, like being that part of the mountain goat expression of Venus, and wanting to create structures, like wanting to create beautiful structures. And in this way, Capricorn is sometimes seen as like the guardian of like limits, and time is one of those things that sometimes seems like finite. And so what are the beautiful structures of time that I can create an offering from my heart that bring more beauty into how we relate to time? And so that has taken this form in the circular moon calendars of like how to bring more and more beauty to this relationship. And within that, feel time as very, that there's an abundance of time, even if it's one lunar cycle, that there's plenty of time, rather than it's like this constriction and this squeezing and this like finite scarcity, which I think many of us are like our first exposure to time, but not our first exposure, but our like learning process of time is like that. It's finite and limited and short. And I think there's a very, twisted relationship with time that doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah. I looked up mine prior to our conversation. So my Venus is in Aquarius.
And
yeah,
Aquarius likes to take to the airwaves.
Yes. Yeah. Personal freedom, I read, creativity, self-expression, basically don't contain me and I'll be great.
Totally. And I feel like, and what you're sharing with this podcast, in that bringing that to the airwaves, I mean, it is bringing it to the collective. It is that concern for like, yes, there's this personal freedom of like, don't box me in, don't try to like label me, because I can, move out and around any box that's put around to confine. That there is such innovation that comes from this very future forward way of being with Aquarius. When people talk about like the age of Aquarius, they're referencing a longer period of time of really shifting old narratives and really like what have those structures. So Capricorn brings us those structures, right? And then Aquarius comes right after that and was like, yeah, let's that foundation, let's not build on that foundation. Like, let's bring that all down and like, let's build new structures that are actually beneficial for the collective. So there's this, this greater humanitarian concern. And so with a Venus in that sign of like, what are the outlets to kind of share that vision? And so, like I said, with the airwaves and with the podcast, it seems very aligned to be
quite fitting. Well, I can tell you that when I fully started to embrace my voice sharing things through the airwaves, bringing things to the collective, speaking freely, creating, challenging old foundations. When all that just kind of came together, which to your point earlier, did not just happen overnight, right? It was a series of decisions and shifting and releasing and gaining and all that stuff. But when all of that finally met, everything got easier. I mean, everything. My follower count went through the roof. The podcast downloads, like the numbers blew my mind, right? The amount of people showing up and saying, yes, I want more. I was like, holy shit, this actually gets to be easier. I don't have to fight every single thing, tooth and nail, and climb and scratch and crawl, right? Like there are periods where you just have to go through the thing to learn the thing, right? Like I don't know that we'll ever get away from that. But when you stop fighting who you naturally are and fully embrace who you actually are, my friends, I'm telling you that everything gets to be fucking easier.
Amen.
Well, I think that we could probably talk about moon stuff all day long, but I want to make sure that everyone knows where they can connect with you. And I believe there's some goodness that you'd like to offer to share with them as well. So let us know.
So you can find the website is themoonismycalendar.com, all one word, the moon is my calendar. And same for the Instagram handle at the moon is my calendar. And so those are the places that I share. Like I am a teacher at heart, and so I love sharing. I just sort of revived my YouTube channel. I have hundreds of videos on Vimeo, but it's a different thing than to go on to YouTube, which feels a lot more public than Vimeo. So I'm just reviving that. And the channel is also The Moon is My Calendar. And right now we're in the pre-sale launch for the 2024. There's a new moon calendar and journal, which really is a place for like daily tracking. There's a place for intentions. There's more of a way to go phase by phase where the dates and the phases are all laid out there. There's a wall calendar that I did the artwork for this year. Another kind of gutsy move where I was working with other artists and showcasing other people's work. And I was like, I love that. I love creating that container. And I'm also like, is that because I'm not actually willing to step into the fact that I'm an artist and I have something to share through what I'm creating? So this year, the theme is the Lunar Harvest Cycle for the wall calendar. And it is like a symbolic expression of the pomegranate, the lunar phases and the pomegranate growth and development and expression over the year. And then there's like an at a glance calendar. It's up on my wall over here. So you know how you can like go to Office Max or whatever and have like, oh, I want to see the whole year all at once. Like I want to see all the cycles all at once. So that's a poster that's actually printed on demand. So that's the one that's shipping now. And the other two are on pre-order. So if for whoever is listening and is like, yes, I want to work with the moon. I want the moon and lunar time like present in my office and in my space, or to have a journal that's a more sort of like taking more like snapshots on a daily basis to the ways that we're showing up for ourselves, then hop over to themoonismycalendar.com and order yours so that you can have it for 2024.
Excellent. Well, we'll make sure we have all of those wonderful links in the show notes. And I would love to know, my friend, what does the word gutsy mean to you?
Yeah, gutsy is a feeling. It's a visceral feeling when it's like, running a retreat in Oaxaca this summer with 1 month notice was a gutsy move. And I know that feeling in my gut, and to trust that feeling to say like, yes, move towards those things that are like, oh my gosh, this seems impossible. When it is truly aligned, like you said, it will flow with more ease and it wants to happen. And those things that want us to be that like vessel or vehicle to make them happen, often we can get that feeling in our gut.
We sure can. Absolutely. My friend, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. The moon is such a powerful force that is really here to guide us. So I appreciate you sharing your knowledge about her.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Look, I love me a good moon talk. I am a sucker for the moon. I am forever going to be the girl that stops and attempts to take a photo of the moon, but it just never comes out the way that you want it to, does it? Listen, I would love to know what you took away from today's episode. Did you learn something new? Is there something you'd love to share? Maybe it's a practice that you have really found to be profound for you. Connect with me and send me a message. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can find me using @thatlauraora. And as always, until I see you next time, Stay gutsy.